Thank you for joining us today. The USC Price School is pleased to present this discussion on Making the Grade, California's Public Schools, as part of our Political Pulse 24 series. This fall, California voters will be asked to weigh in on local public school boards and ballot measures. To help set this context, we will talk about the findings from a recent poll on Californians and education and hear from 3 leaders and experts about the issues confronting California's schools in 2024. Joining me today are Alberto Carvalho, the superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District, Linda Darling-Hammond, who's the president of the California State Board of Education, and Julie Marsh, who is the USC Professor of Education Policy. Thank you for being here. If you have a question for any of our participants, please send it to the Q&A on the Zoom screen. We appreciate your including your name and organization with your question, and we'll have some time at the end of the program for our panelists to answer your questions. And if you have a question for me, please send it as well. Before we get started, there are a few items I want to make sure the audience is aware of. First, the USC Price School does not take or support positions on ballot measures or candidates in the election. The USC Price School is hosting today's program and Political Pulse 24 series to give Californians a better understanding of the important issues that they'll be deciding on the ballot this year. Thank you for understanding that. And in the interest of time and fairness, the panelists will limit their responses to about 2 or 3 minutes. And the speaking order for my questions will begin alphabetically by last name for the first question and then alternate with each question. We're waiting for the superintendent to arrive, so we're going to go off script a little bit here already at the beginning. But let's start with my first question. And the first question is, what do you think is the most important issue facing California's K-12 public education system in 2024? Why is that, and what else is on top of your list? But before I ask the panelists, I just want to give you a sense of what the public said when we asked them that question. There wasn't any answer that got more than 10% of respondents agreeing to what the most important issue is. 10% said concerns about standards, 10% said lack of funding, 9% said concerns about political ideology influencing education, 7% said concerns about education, 6% said quality of teachers. Other things that were mentioned were inadequate preparation for college life, safety and security, teaching retention, bullying, large class sizes, lack of discipline, low teacher pay, and many, many other kinds of responses. Well, Linda, let's start off by asking you, what do you think is the most important issue facing California's K-12 public education system in 2024?
Well, if we were asking this question in 2014, I would have said funding. You know, that was right before we launched the local control funding formula. And in this administration, the amount of money going to schools has increased by more than 30%. So we're in a better position than we were a decade ago on funding, when we were one of the worst in the country and conditions in California schools had bottomed out. I would never speak against adding more progressive funding to our schools, but I would say that I think the most pressing issue in some ways is that we have inherited sort of a factory model school design from 100 years ago. The world around us is changing rapidly. Knowledge is exploding. Technologies are changing. The needs that students have for social and emotional supports are much more obvious to us. So I think one of our critical issues is how we invent a school system that is forward-looking for the present that we experience in the future, moving beyond the factory model that we inherited to create schools that are engaging, exciting, that are supportive, in social, emotional, and academic ways. And there's a lot underway to try to move the Titanic, if you will. I hope it's not the Titanic, but an ocean liner that will continue to stay afloat in the direction of schools that are really aimed at the century that we are in.
Thank you. Julie.
I can't commit, just like the public can't commit to one issue. So I'm going to say a few. I do think, we should be worried about student well-being and chronic absenteeism and accelerating learning. But I think more importantly, we need to think about system level issues. And I think if we don't address these, then we're not going to see improvements for students. So while yes, there's been improvement, Linda, I would argue there's still lots of financial challenges with declining enrollment and the expiration of the federal COVID relief funds and all of that. So that's one. I think politics and leadership are interconnected in my mind. I think we have superintendents who are telling us that they are stressed out, and I'm sure Superintendent Cavallo could speak to that, given all the politics and already the challenging aspects of the job. Lots of superintendents are leaving their jobs, and we're getting a lot of less experienced folks and some struggle to find those replacements. I think school boards are also feeling the strains and seeing turnover, and I'd expect that to get even higher in the coming years. And then I want to think about staffing issues. I think we face challenges and always have in attracting and retaining folks in the profession and preparing and supporting our teachers. And then I think bigger level issues that are important. We talk a lot about problems of practice. I think we need to think about problems of policy and governance, and PACE is working really hard on that. What is the right role of the state in a local control state? And I think we have some room to improve in this area, given how fragmented our governance system is and the sort of lack of clear lines of authority and lots of capacity issues. And then I guess my final issue that, again, they're all related, is just that, there's a lot of effort out there to erode trust in public schools right now, given some of the infusion of funding going into school boards and into these culture war kinds of conflicts. And I don't think we should discount that. I think the end game we're seeing in other states around universal vouchers and ESA programs, and it's trying to find its way into California. And while we think the majority of parents are really quite satisfied, I think we need to be thinking about a more well-organized defense of public education.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Alberto Carvalho, who is the superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District. Thank you for joining us. We heard from your staff that you were busy doing the work of being superintendent and would be a few minutes late. So I started with the other panelists, and I look forward to your response to our first question, which is, what do you think is the most important issue facing California's K-12 public education system in 2024? And feel free to go from state to local in your case. It's, you, I think, can speak to both areas.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Great to see all of you. I have some meaningful connections with some of the folks on the panel, and it's always great to have a chat with you about the issues that, quite frankly, matter, not only to kids in our schools, our communities, but democracy as a whole, right? So I'll follow your advice as you pose the question, and I'll speak from a statewide perspective locally, but also embed part of it, some of the federal nuances that I think cannot be ignored. And I actually heard from two of my colleague panelists some of those issues. Certainly, we cannot ignore, the massive projected deficit, no matter who you listen to, that the state is facing. This is the building of the perfect storm, right? Not only are we dealing with a projected deficit, I believe will be felt not only for this year, but probably for a couple of years. But it is happening at a time when the federal COVID recovery funding is evaporating. So impact to Los Angeles Unified, for example, is $5.7 billion that were fully operational and available over the past couple of years that will sunset this September. That shock to the system that relied for the first time ever on some degree of adequacy, even though it was short-lived and fueled with short-term funding. But quite frankly, this is the first time ever that probably, inclusive of all funds, we reached a modicum of funding adequacy in the K-12 space. And it is sad that now it is disappearing, because the symptoms and the gaps and the challenges that our communities face certainly have not eased or improved. But I'm not going to focus my answer strictly on the basis of funding, because funding dollars alone will not solve the problems that we're facing. They never have. It is important, but not the unique factor that will lift the possibility for our kids. I am very concerned about, number one, statewide, a lack of agreement over what the projected deficit really is. And considering that in the state of California, we need to declare and prepare and project for a 3-year budget scenario, it makes it very, very difficult for us to idealize two scenarios when the two of them are separated by such a massive projected deficit. Secondly, I am very concerned about, and I think this has already been spoken about the fact that we are attempting to solve for budget woes, improving reading and math proficiency graduation rates, not just to pre-pandemic levels, because those should be not acceptable to anyone. Simply go back to where we were pre-pandemic is unacceptable, while simultaneously dealing with the social, emotional, mental health crisis that is so pervasive across our school communities. In an era where at the federal level, education is a non-issue. No candidate is speaking about a platform for educational improvement or a conversation about adjustments, at least the cost of living specific to entitlement programs or IDEA, which has historically fallen short of its mandate. The only thing that we hear as far as the political scene is concerned specific to public education are the non-issues. Critical race theory, which is not taught in K-12 settings, but it's a red herring that appeals to the base. Or this assault on the rights of kids and teachers by insulting or passing policies or at least a narrative that diminishes the immigrant or the LGBTQ+. Outside of those two issues, there is zero conversation specific to federal interest by the leading candidates on education, funding, or policy alike.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments, and I'm sure we'll get back to a lot of these issues later on. So I'm already going to go off script a little bit in terms of the questions that I was going to ask, because you brought up the issue of the state's deficit, Superintendent, and we have Linda and Julie here who thought about this issue too, and Linda in particular working through this issue. And so I want to frame a question for each of you to come back to now about how the current state budget deficit will impact schools. And, what about Proposition 98, the funding guarantees that come along with public education? And, beyond that, some of the issues around declining school enrollment, what that might mean for per pupil spending. I mean, the whole thing for the public, I can tell you, is very complicated. I have only like one person who can explain Prop 98 to me. Maybe Linda can as well. But, Linda, your perspective on where we are with the state budget deficit, is it going to be something that's harmful to schools? And Julie, then we'd like to hear from you, and then back to the superintendent on this too.
Well, the deficit is real and troubling. Schools have been more protected than many other parts of the budget. And the legislature just yesterday night announced its proposal for coming together with the governor on a resolution for this coming year. There was a flap about how to calculate Prop 98 and what the gains are that the CTA brought up, and that has been resolved this week. So there's progress being made on getting to some current resolutions. Education has been largely protected, but is not moving forward. And as Alberto mentioned, we're losing the federal funds that have been in place at a time where we're just basically going to be able to hold steady on the state funds. We're not going to be able to move ahead as we have in recent years. I will say the administration has been very good about continuing to invest in education relative to all of the challenges that are there. And declining enrollment does not mean that our overall per pupil spending will go down. It will actually go up, because of the declining enrollment. But at the level of local districts, it can make a big difference because we are still a state that does its allocation of funding, in ways that are very tied not only to average daily enrollment, but attendance, where chronic absenteeism then becomes yet another challenge for folks to contend with. But I think we will come through with sort of steady state in education. That's what the governor is committed to, continuing to invest in TK, which, as you know, the public in the poll that you shared with us is really in favor of continuing to invest in, keeping the local control funding formula moving slightly forward. But there are great needs. And this is the other piece of it. And I think certainly it's being felt in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Just in the last year, the proportion of students that are low income in California has gone up to 63%.
Wow.
That's a major increase over the prior year. The number of kids who are experiencing homelessness has continued to increase. We're in a society where, as the superintendent noted, there's no federal conversation about education to speak of, nor is there much conversation about how to support children and families at this point, right? So we have, as my friend Gloria Latson-Billings often puts it, we have aggressive neglect of our children in this society, and then the schools are expected to pick up all of those pieces. And, many wonderful things are going on in that space, community schools that wrap around students with integrated supports, investments in mental health and social emotional learning. But it's a very tall order for free universal meals. All of these things fall on schools in this country to, ensure that children have a basis on which to then focus on learning. And when money gets tight and when other parts of the budget get cut, housing supports or other things that families need, we will feel it in the schools.
Thank you. Julie, how do you see it, the state budget deficit and its impacts on schools?
Well, I think it's going to affect some districts more than others. I think that the districts that received more of the COVID funds, so places that have more low-income students, are probably going to feel the effects more so. I think there are some districts that had created bigger reserves than others. And so it's going to vary. But, there are places that agreed to staff raises, and there are programs that were put into place around expanded learning and tutoring that, in some places they actually hired folks with these monies. Others decided not to do that. So it will vary, but it's certainly, and places that have a reserve are going to handle it a little bit better. But, we're facing potential layoffs, potential closures of schools, and I think at the worst case, you might see places that are insolvent or might have to be taken over by the state. But I think there are some real concerns here. I mean, even before all of this, I think our state was, in terms of our teacher salaries, in terms of our adult student ratios, were, and per pupil funding, we're already at a pretty low level. And so I do think this is going to have a significant impact on schools. And some of the maneuvering around the budget, which again, I'm hoping Linda can explain to all of us, I think will matter a lot more in not this year, but perhaps in the future years. And I think that's what the debate is over right now in terms of the maneuvering that has been done around the revised funding projections. So we may not even see it here. We might see it in another year or so.
Okay, thank you. Superintendent, would you like to say anything else about it?
Sure. I will concur very briefly with what was already stated. I do think, number one, that K-12 education has been held pretty harmless in terms of budget, ongoing conversation specific to the budget, even though one cannot diminish the fact that the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, which was projected to be just 6 months ago, at around 3.49%, was decreased to 1.07% after it was previously decreased to just 0.7%. So we appreciate that it went from 0.7% to 1.07, but it's still significantly lower than the previously advertised COLA. That, just to give some perspective to that issue, that means a $600 million reduction to Los Angeles Unified. The COLA is the live fuel of compensation increases, recognizing that the economic conditions in our state, the cost of living, cost of housing, particularly in urban areas like Los Angeles, are extremely high. So that is a hit, notwithstanding the administration's efforts at holding K-12 education harmless. We certainly appreciate the fact that continuing investments into early education are sustained and continue. We're particularly happy about that, for we decided that we would make UTK universal in Los Angeles Unified 2 years prior to the state's mandate for two reasons. Everybody's experiencing enrollment drops. We're not going to be able to recruit new high school or middle school kids. The one chance we have is by energizing young parents of young kids to bring them in as early as possible. And if our product, our services are compelling enough, if all that we do is compelling enough, we will keep them. So that's our bet. And we've seen a phenomenal increase in the number of UTK students enrolled in our school system. So we are happy that some elements of the budget are in fact protecting K-12 education. We are absolutely dissatisfied with the COLA adjustment at two levels, specific first to its inadequacy. Secondly, I find it very difficult to accept that in a state like California, a sophisticated state, we could not come up with a more sophisticated measure of economic conditions by region. One single COLA statewide does not reflect the regional economic differences that are seen from Southern to Central to Northern California. It does not take the same level of dollar consumption to educate all children in the state of California. There have to be adjustments specific to economic conditions that are seen by region. The last point I will make is, look, we were one of those districts where our teachers had not seen a salary increase in quite a while. And we did increase salaries for our teachers, for our classified personnel in a meaningful way, adjusting it for the local economic conditions. And we were depending on that 3.47 COLA to satisfy those salary increases. So it is an imposition on us. It is difficult. However, we are in a privileged position. And I think it was stated right before I began to answer your question. For those districts that anticipated the crisis, anticipated the fragility of economic conditions in the state of California, in addition to the evaporation of ESSER funding, we prepared. So we have adequate reserves that will burn out very quickly as they consume these compensation increases, but we can sustain it at least for the projected timeline of 2 to 3 years, without layoffs, without terminations, without real cessation of essential programs for our students. And by the way, I want to challenge one thing that was said. Yes, there is a lack of teachers and even support personnel at this point across America, but we have an equally strong problem, which is a talent distribution. It's not just that we don't have enough teachers. At some point, we ought to stop, press the pause button, and really ask the question, in our school systems, where are the credentialed people? And are a lot of the credentialed people doing quasi-administrative jobs rather than being in a classroom? I can tell you right now, in the second largest district in the country, I prefer to say the largest independent district in the country, we have no teacher vacancies. All of our slots are filled. I think it's a function of redeployment of talent from central offices, regional offices, back into the classroom side by side with attractive, fair to the economic conditions, compensation agreements. But no doubt, conditions are challenging. And at some point, I would hope, and I know my colleague Linda Darling-Hammond will be at this. And she, by the way, she has answers for everything. I agree. At some point, California ought to reassess the way it funds schools and the way it generates funds for schools. So funding schools on the basis of average daily attendance, as opposed to a more reliable, scientifically acceptable measure of enrollment, may be influenced by attendance, but not dominated by attendance, makes more sense. Otherwise, you're going to continue to injure districts like Los Angeles, where you have chronic illnesses, suffered by kids. And because of sick kids, every other kid pays the price. That is not fair. Secondly, our over-reliance on capital gains to sustain public education, as opposed to more reliable funding streams, that needs to be looked at. That's why we're seeing this massive projected deficit when just 2 years ago we had a massive surplus. It does not make sense.
Could I just add on a comment or two, because I think these are really important points. We in California have made great gains in terms of adding money to the education budget and spending it progressively. But when you look at the rankings that are done across states of sort of adequacy, progressivity, and level of effort, we get an A in progressivity, a C in adequacy, and an F in effort as the amount of the state budget that's spent on education. And that gets back to the revenue source question that I think is being raised. And it's one that, at some point has to be dealt with. We are making progress, but there's a lot more progress that needs to be made. The earlier point that Julie made about, that we have shortages, we have turnover of superintendents. Certainly we have that. We have turnover, high rates of attrition of principals and of teachers. And having a living wage is important. Having compensation that can keep people in the profession, and we know that actually effectiveness in teaching increases not just for the first 3 years, but over the course of the career, as long as there's professional learning going on. And Los Angeles, I think, demonstrates some of that in the many efforts they've made. But on the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, the only district in the nation to have increases in reading at 4th and 8th grade level was Los Angeles, where there was both the investments in the quality of the curriculum and teaching, as well as, the additional summer programming and after school programming and so on. So we make progress. We do not dare, let our foot off the gas pedal at this point, and turn back to the devastating situation that California was once in, as Julie mentioned earlier.
First of all, let me just say that I really like when panelists talk to each other. And Julie, you were shaking your head. If you have anything you want to add on this, if not, I want to go on to another question. So, I do a lot of polls, and I look for areas in which there's great consensus. The one area in which I saw maybe the most consensus in this survey is that 78% of Californians said the children in their local community fell behind during the pandemic. That was 78%. Have students recovered from the learning losses today? And what's being done for those who still need to catch up academically in 2024? Julie, let's start with you this time, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, PACE did some analyses. We released it, I think, at the beginning of the year that showed that the achievement hadn't rebounded post-COVID, and that the math and ELA scores were still well below the pandemic levels. So there were some improvements, but we're still pretty far behind. And I think most concerning and there are still some of these opportunity gaps that we're seeing between certain student groups. So I think the focus needs to be on accelerating learning. And I think, PACE did some research looking at CCE has been supporting a professional learning community kind of model that relies a lot on teacher collaboration and student support. And they've found some pretty promising results. And I think this is the kind of work that, Linda, you've studied in your career, where we really do need to be investing in teachers and in providing time and opportunity for teachers to meet for additional time to support students who need that extra support, whether that's after school weekends, whatnot. So, but I think the collaborative model is one that's quite promising. And I think places that are investing in teachers are really going to see the biggest bang for their buck with the dollars that they have to try and get to sort of move beyond the sort of stagnation that we're seeing in learning. And then it does have to be coupled with support around mental health and well-being. And we know those things are very much related. And so systems that are able to support students around social and emotional well-being and development in those areas have to also be coupled in here, along with support about getting students to school. And I think, the superintendent spoke about some of those challenges and probably witnessed them today. There has to be more that's done to engage students to want to come to school and engage in the learning, and then the supports to help them. The issue around attending school isn't just about folks not wanting to come, it's that they might lack transportation, they might not have the healthcare. So I think efforts around community schools are another promising sort of lever that I know the state has invested heavily in that would support kind of the whole child, that will enable then the learning and the results that people are looking for in terms of test scores, which are only one measure of student well-being that we need to be thinking about more holistically.
Let's turn to the superintendent on that and then get Linda's perspective on the state level.
Well, number one, ditto to everything that was just said. Number one, the learning loss persists. I don't care what anybody says. Whether you're looking at NAEP data nationally or by state, when you look at the long-term trend that is in place now for 40 years, math and reading levels are what they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, that's a national perspective. So 30 years of progress have been erased according to NAEP. And I speak both as superintendent, but also a recently departed member of the National Assessment Governing Board that decreased policy on national assessment. If you're looking at the smarter balance data for the state of California, on average, and I can speak specifically to Los Angeles Unified, kids lost the equivalent of 6 to 7 years of academic gains. We have our fingers crossed to see what this year's results will be. And we're very hopeful because of what interim assessment data, particularly iReady data, is telling us in Dibbles. What will it take? I agree with all the strategies that were already mentioned. There's a great deal of potential associated with the theory of action specific to community schools. Why? Because it makes sense. It is a holistic approach. It engages the community, creates a space for teachers to collaborate, right? But I think we're going to need more than that. We need more effective, strategic, data-driven, differentiated instruction for longer periods of time, before, after school programming, but before and after school programming that do not replicate what happens during the bell-to-bell time. Needs to be diverse, appealing, with balance between enrichment activities and academic acceleration. Otherwise, you're going to reach student fatigue very, very quickly. Summer sessions, winter sessions, spring break sessions, we've had them all, but we don't have it all for all students. Targeting the students who absolutely need it. And by the way, the kids who absolutely need it actually benefit from being in school because they depend on nutrition. They depend on the social emotional support, the mental health support that they do not get at home, unfortunately. In addition to that, reaching higher levels of coherence specific to curriculum, honing in on the retooling and reskilling of teacher skill sets, particularly in the area of reading. I think the state has taken bold steps in solidifying what makes sense as far as how to teach reading, but there are still some struggles. I think we are deploying here in Los Angeles the appropriate strategies for professional development to bring greater coherence. The last 2 points, don't ignore the parents. We have a parent academy. To the extent that we help parents become demand-driven parents as opposed to supply-sided parents, the systems will accelerate on their delivery of more effective teaching to kids. That's why we created the Parent Academy, turning every parent into a dangerous entity with a voice that actually knows how to differentiate opportunity from lack thereof. And then lastly, we cannot leave the private sector alone in this conversation. They need to get their act together too. We should not have to go through an insane process to determine which instructional curriculum materials, whether it's textbooks, digital content, is absolutely aligned with state standards and reflect the best practices of how to teach kids how to read, write, compute, know their history, social studies, how to think critically, and the like. So I think those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
And I'll plus one and make a couple of other points. So, we are seeing already some double-digit gains in achievement in community schools that have really been at it for a few years now and are making a lot of progress. It is the whole child piece, but it's also many investments in the academic, personalization of academic learning. As the superintendent was just saying, during the pandemic on the NAEP scores, on the national scores, California fell back less than most other states in reading and math. As I noted, Los Angeles actually surged ahead in reading. We lost no ground in eighth grade reading in California. I think it was because we were making investments in learning recovery and summer school and community schools and all the things that we were doing during that time. The Smarter Balanced assessments, interestingly, just as a clarification, to test much more than reading. They're harder tests than most states have. So they actually assess reading, writing, listening, and research, along with, the other core. NAEP is just a reading test, so our assessments are much more robust and include performance tests and so on. And we have quite a bit of ground to make up on, and it's mostly in writing. So we have to be doing reading and writing, and we have to be, bringing students to that whole curriculum. The point that Alberto made about the enrichment, balance with the academics is so important in multiple ways. There's studies from the RAND Corporation about summer programs finding that those that include enrichment secure greater gains in achievement than those that are just academic, because you have to get kids there, you got to get them excited, but also brain development. What we know from neuroscience about brain development tells us that our wiring in our brains, our intelligences, are enhanced by music, by art, by world languages, by inquiry that wakens the brain up, if you will, by green space, by physical activity. All those things actually wire our brains in ways that are more effective than not having those stimuli available. So we need to remember, I just say this because there's so much concern about learning loss, that to have learning acceleration, we need to be thinking about all of those things, not just sitting kids down and drilling them, in reading and math, which happened in California, years ago. And I think we have a much more holistic perspective now, and I think that's going to stand us in good stead. The final thing I'll note is that I mentioned the factory model constraints that we have, which had the idea that you put kids on a conveyor belt and you kind of move them along with standardized lessons. The teacher sees, if they're middle or high school, 30 kids at a time, as I did when I was teaching high school, and they just, kind of go through, you stamp them with lessons. Some of the kids get it, they go move forward, some of them don't, they drop out. And the factory model was designed for that to be perfectly okay. That's not perfectly okay now. And people are really working now to think about, how do you personalize, how do you tailor, how do you engage the tutoring, the small group work. I know there's some interesting work in Los Angeles going on with AI tools to help personalize, the reinforcements of learning. So again, we have to break out of that idea that somehow we're all just going to march through the curriculum at the same way and the same pace. We really need to use this time to use time, space, teacher teams, and tools much more flexibly to allow kids to learn where they are. If you can help kids, if you can locate where they are in their learning on the continuum and teach to that at that moment, the gains are much greater than if you teach over their heads or under their heads, or teach to the average all the time. So that's a really important part of what I think we see a lot of leaders in California doing and taking up, and it's going to be really important to our recovery.
Thank you.
I'll interject very quickly. Linda's so right. The factory model worked well in the factory. It is not the best model for kids in schools, number one. Just like the agrarian model worked well in the farm, not necessarily as the best way to organize time of education throughout the year for kids. And at some point, we really ought to look to what Linda said, how kids learn, aligning the instructional components to their own psychological development. And right now, sometimes that does not happen. We have a golden opportunity. I mean, the pandemic was terrible. We know that. But we have a golden opportunity, recognizing how terrible it was, to rather than simply attempt to go back and accelerate towards conditions pre-pandemic, to actually reinvent what we do and how we do. Because we do have the benefit of now a decade's worth of peer-reviewed research that should guide that reinvention of what schooling is. And trust me, it will actually be better for kids. It will be more humane for teachers, allow for greater collaboration, allow for the creation of more holistic ecosystems where kids actually thrive in, right? And there's nothing that stops us from doing that. And considering the progressive nature of our state, which I agree 100% with, this is the state where we could actually move the needle of American public education. This is a state where it can actually happen. You have so many disconnected best practice examples across districts. Now is the time. And I'm the eternal optimist. I do think we're on the right track despite the challenges. It's just a matter of continuing to accelerate and bring in the best thinking, the best practices, the best research. It's no longer a skill set deficit. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's a will set conundrum. We know what to do. Do we have the courage to actually push it to get it done?
Can I just add, though, that I think it's also a capacity issue. So even if we know what to do, how do we, in a state like California, ensure that folks at all districts have the capacity to actually do these things? Mm-hmm. And I think that we really still, I'm going to harp back on this question of what's the role of the state and what's the role of other governance structures in our state. Given the low capacity, low funding that we have to the Department of Ed, given the variability and the quality of the county offices and how loosely coupled they are, given the fact that CCEE lacks authority to impact capacity at scale, we've got this patchwork of vendors, we've got school board members who aren't necessarily prepared, we've got leaders turning over and workforce shortages. I love these ideas, but I think we also need to be focusing on these sort of higher level structures to make sure that the ideas can actually get implemented across our state. And to me, that's a huge problem we need to be tackling.
Thank you.
I would not disagree with you.
I'm sorry?
I would not disagree with Julie on that. Okay. I mean, I think there are places where we are making some progress, but there is, it's a complicated state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to just mention to our audience that you're not going to have an opportunity like this to ask questions like I am right now. So if you want to put any questions in chat, I can't think of three better people to ask questions to than on this topic than the ones that we have today. So go ahead before our time runs out. I want to turn to another finding in the survey that surprised me. It's the first time I asked this question, but 63% of Californians said that they're very or somewhat concerned about chronic absenteeism in their local public schools. I'm not even sure this was on people's radars, a few years ago, but 63% said in their local public schools they're concerned about that. I'd like to get a sense from each of you about how worried you are about this topic and what's being done about students who are absent. And by the way, chronic absenteeism defined in different ways, but the most common one I came across was 10% or more total school days in a year that a student is missing classes. So that's a different kind of problem than what we're talking about so far, which is how do we make the most out of the classroom? We've got issues with getting people into the classroom. Who would like to start?
I'd love to. I think that a lot is being done. And again, I see many of the examples in community schools where they're able to reach out and access kids and parents and solve all kinds of problems that, need to be addressed in terms of kids wanting to be and then being able to be in school. One person I was talking to recently was talking about how they solved a transportation problem for a student experiencing homelessness who then went from having, being absent 40 days to being absent 0 days because they figured out what the problem was and solved it. But I also want to note that chronic absenteeism today is not what it was before the pandemic. Number one, there's still a lot of illness. I just went through a COVID surge, recently, and that's still happening, and RSV and all kinds of other illnesses that kids experience. And climate events are happening. We had 1,300, at least, minimally 1,300 climate events last year that prevented kids from getting to school. About 1,000 of those included school closings, and then there were others that kids couldn't, the roads were flooded, they were snowed in, there were winds, there were fires. That's going to increase. So chronic absenteeism is all of those things. And one of the things I think we need to do, in addition to enabling kids to get to school when schools are open and they can and they're not sick and all of the rest of it, but we also need to be putting in place a kind of approach to instructional continuity. And I borrowed this from Superintendent Carvalho when he was in Miami. He put in place instructional continuity plans for when the hurricanes came, right, and the flooding and all of that, so that kids could get their laptops and go, be back in school, shortly thereafter with their teachers. And we have some proposals actually right now being discussed in the legislature to enable districts to more easily, that's the goal, we got to move bureaucracy out of the way, be able to maintain instructional continuity, both for kids who might be home quarantined or, able to be in school but not in class, and for events where there are times where kids can't get to school because of the weather events that are going on, so that education doesn't stop. And it's not only about seat time. And so we need to be doing all of those things.
I'll just add, I think these two are probably better suited to talk about what to do in terms of on the ground, but I think that it is an issue, and it's not just an across the board issue. I think absenteeism is hitting certain student groups more, right? So we're seeing with students with disabilities, youth in foster care, and Black students in particular. And so I think then the question becomes, what can we do for those particular groups as well? So not to just think about this as a sort of across the board, there's one set of strategies. I think, again, it brings up for me issues around special ed, which the superintendent already brought up, but we need to be thinking about how we're preparing and, fully prepared sort of special ed teachers and investing in special ed to keep up with the needs. I think we need to think about our particular student populations that might be facing this issue of chronic absenteeism more than others, and we have to be targeted in the approaches that we take.
And those can sometimes be issues of illness with students with disabilities who are medically fragile and also can't brave coming into environments sometimes where, there's illness and no masking and all of that. But it's also cases where students have been bullied or not able to feel fully accepted in schools. And we see that showing up in lots of ways. Some of it is absenteeism. Some of it is people going into micropods, and creating different settings in which kids feel safer. So we have a lot of different issues going on that, again, our willingness and ability to be creative and inventive and go for the root causes and create school environments that are supportive for all students are going to be really important for.
I will simply add that chronic absenteeism reached immediately after the pandemic, as we returned kids back to schools, a crisis level that was without a precedent in the US. 2 years ago, chronic absenteeism in Los Angeles was at 50%. Pre-pandemic, chronic absenteeism levels were around 19% for the 2017, 2018, 2019 school years. So that huge growth is just worrisome. What's working? So we were in a terrible place. there are a number of strategies that have actually paid off here. And I think my colleagues spoke about what the research says, what the real issues are. Illness has not gone away. Communities that have a poor environmental record where chronic respiratory illness is at a premium, like Los Angeles, those kids are still suffering, pandemic or no pandemic. Yeah. So those kids often are going to stay home. Kids who live in dangerous neighborhoods where safe passage is not guaranteed, where they have to cross gang rival territory, often stay home because they know what the consequences may be. But let me tell you what we've learned as a result of our I Attend efforts, which we started last year. And this was a way of generating lists of chronic absent kids and prioritizing those lists, assigning a number of chronically absent kids to everyone in the school system that does not work as a classroom teacher or as an interventionist or a coach. Last year, I had 30 kids assigned to me. Today, I knocked on 2 doors. Today, across the district, we knocked on over 4,000 doors. This year, we've knocked on 39,000 doors. We began this last year. So we go in armed with data, right? A multi-year trend data for those children, ranked on the basis of most chronically absent to least. Once you knock on the door, you have an opportunity. And by the way, I don't go alone. Nobody goes alone. You go with attendance counselors, with psychiatric social workers, often the principals of the schools themselves. And what we're after is, what are the root causes that are impacting your child? And can we learn from these parents who, by the way, don't poll easily? They don't respond to questionnaires easily, right? There's a reason as to why their kids are disconnected. And often the kids are disconnected and the families too are disconnected. So these are not going to be the voices that will fill out questionnaires or environmental surveys or what have you. Here's what we found out. You have older kids caring for younger kids because parents are working 2 and 3 jobs. Heartbreaking. You have kids who recently arrived in the country with their parents or an adult who don't understand the legal responsibilities of enrollment in school. You have kids who are of high school age who entered the workforce directly, never made a stop in our schools. You have kids who are victims alongside their parents of misinformation and disinformation specific to health conditions in schools. And then you have the whole issue regarding the status of immigration that parents fear. They listen to what's said on TV. They are afraid that if they enroll their kids in school, somehow they're going to get deported. You put all those together, right, on top of general illness experienced by kids. You add all those elements, and guess what? The same kids who generationally have been left behind continue to be left behind. Chronic absenteeism does not hit every community the same. You said it, and you're absolutely right. Black and brown kids, poor kids, immigrant kids, English language learners. Top of the list, homeless and kids in foster care.
Yeah.
All right. So the approach cannot be the same approach to every kid. So our approach here, which has paid off, is very organic, very specific to communities. I mean, we have reached critical mass of direct contact with these families with accompanying solutions for these families. So we went from 50% chronic absenteeism 2 years ago. Last year, we closed out the year at 36.8% chronic absenteeism. This year, we just broke below 30%. We are now at around 28% based on last quarter data. I think we will end within the next couple of weeks, probably around 25%. Our goal is to go below pre-pandemic chronic absenteeism levels going into next year, which, as I said earlier, we're at 19%. It is an issue. No matter how great teachers are, they cannot teach the absent child. And in the state of California, and I want to repeat it, the absent child has an impact on everybody else's funding. So it is bad educationally, it is devastating economically.
And
Thank
just
you.
to that point, California is one of only 6 states in the country that still funds schools based on average daily attendance. The other 44 states are funding, based on average daily membership, so that you use your resources, they're stable, and that's part of the resource you use to get kids back in school, among other things.
We're almost out of time, and we have some questions from our audience that I want to make sure that we get to. One question was, what specific state and federal policies are you hoping to see passed in the coming years? I'll ask each of you that.
I'll go first. Federally speaking, I certainly hope that there are tighter controls over the promise of fully funding IDEA at 40% of the average cost for students with disabilities. In the best years, we have maybe come close to 50% of that, at 20%. So stricter controls on that. I think at the state level, I think I actually mentioned it. I would love to see, and we as a school community have sponsored bills in Sacramento specific to that transition from ADA-driven education funding to more enrollment-based education funding. Another element that I think is near and dear to my heart is universal pre-K. It makes sense. The research endorses it. This should be an easy conversation to be had. And lastly, one more statewide. The physical infrastructure of schools across the state of California is quickly decaying. Not every community has the ability to pass a bond. We have been successful and we'll go back at it again. But the concept of a statewide capital bond is critically important to modernize our schools, to ensure that every kid is learning in a dignified school environment.
Others? Well, let's move on to another question, if not. But
no, I'd love to weigh in.
Okay.
I think Julie probably would too.
Okay, good.
On the federal front, we need more commitment of funding, not only in IDEA, but in other parts of the federal budget as well. There was a time prior to the 1980s when education funding was 12%. All of the federal part was 12% of the education funding of a bigger pot. We lost a lot of ground, both federally and in the states during the Great Recession. We're still trying to get back. So I think there's always that. I'd like to see a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that really supports the kind of forward-looking approaches that we're talking about here, that moves us towards more meaningful assessments, more supportive continuous improvement strategies. That's for the next administration. In California, we've started a lot of things that we've mentioned in this conversation, which in the poll were very much supported by the public and parents, that I hope we will be able to continue, because a number of them were started with one-time funding. And this has been a pattern in California. You do some wonderful things, then the funding goes down, as we talked about, and then you stop doing those and go on to something else. So community schools need to become a routine part of how we educate students. Universal TK, which 80+% of the public supports. We need to continue to invest in our teachers. We have been starting residency programs. We've been starting $20,000 scholarships for people who go into teaching. These have made a big difference in the teacher workforce. Those all need to continue. We're going to need to continue to invest in that workforce. And finally, we're moving now towards really investing in a career master plan, and making the investments not only to prepare kids for college, but also for careers, which are often one and the same now. They're not like necessarily two different separated tracks. But that was a place where, 60% of the public said they felt like kids were getting prepared for college, but just a little over half said the same about being prepared for careers. And huge proportions, I think it was 80%, said it's so important to invest in career technical education programs. We just enacted Golden State Pathways to really look at forward-looking careers in the state, invest in those starting in high school, make it easier for kids to get college credits while they're in high school, get on that trajectory. So I think these are all things that really need to continue. Last point I'll make, and this was a shock to me, 84% of Californians said they thought it was very important for kids to learn about race, about accurate history, about the history that we've had. This is really part of our ethnic studies commitment in the state, unlike many other places where we see, debate about whether to teach accurate history. So we need to continue as well to have that commitment to our students. All of these are things that are going to require, recommitment in the coming years.
I won't, I know we're running out of time and I don't want to rehash. I mean, I think the funding issues are incredibly important around IDEA, students with disabilities. I think an enrollment-based funding model is paramount. I think investing more in teacher preparation and recruitment and the teacher workforce is essential. I think we need to think about accountability. I do think we need to reauthorize the SEA. I think we need to focus on multiple measures and be careful about what we're measuring there. I think the support infrastructure for our districts. Not every district is LA Unified with the resources that LA Unified, granted they're limited and you have a lot more students, but there are 1,000 districts in our state. A lot of them are not really well resourced, have the capacity. Our county offices need some help. I think we need to think about creating more stability in our system with the turnover that we're seeing in our leadership. And then as a professor here, I would often have to say, we need more on research and evaluation. We need longitudinal data. We need to be able to track students better. And we haven't been able to do that as a state.
Yeah. And we need more panels and discussions like we had today. I can't believe how fast the time went. We learned a lot in an hour from the three of you. And I really want to thank Alberta Carvalho, Linda Darling-Hammond, and Julie Marsh for joining us today. And also my colleagues, Giovanna and Gio at the USC Price School for all their help with this timely event. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Stay tuned for future Political Pulse 24 events to discuss state and local issues in 2024 and state and local ballot measures on the November election. Thank you for joining us, and please be safe and have a good afternoon. Thank you.